Welcome back everyone to our continued look at the history of the Fountainhead Palace. In the last episode we discussed how the flute nobles represent the original nobles of the palace and how they were most likely Heian nobility. We also looked at their transformation and how they began to prey on the vitality of youth, starting with their own wives and children before accepting brides from Mibu village as victims to prey upon, and bribing their fathers with promises of joining the nobility. This routine at the palace wouldn't last forever though, and it all began to change because of the Okami. The Okami were a group of warrior women who were drawn to the Fountainhead Palace in an attempt to directly worship the Divine Dragon. Why was this particular group of women drawn to the Divine Dragon? The reason for that may be in their name, as Reddit user Kyra Taylor suggests. In fact, the name Okami is a reference to Kurokome, or Okami no Kami, a Japanese dragon deity of rain and snow. In a previous video, I discussed how the Divine Dragon is most likely based off the imagery of Seiryu, but the dragon god Kurokome is another dragon deity with a strong connection to water. As a result, for the Okami women who worshipped him, the Divine Dragon must have been seen as a manifestation of Kurokome. They may have even been hoping to become brides of the dragon, as suggested by Reddit user NotKyle7, who drew comparisons between the male energy of the dragon and its female counterpart, the phoenix. Kurokome himself is commonly depicted with another water god, Kuramitsuha, who is either his wife or a medium in service of him depending on the interpretation, so this could very well have been the goal of the Okami women. But there is still an obvious question that seems to get glossed over a lot. How on earth did the Okami women complete the Fountainhead Fragrance? The Fountainhead Fragrance has a list of very specific ingredients that Sekiro spends much of the game attempting to collect. So how were the Okami women able to gather these same ingredients? Well, they were clearly determined enough in their quest to reach the Divine Realm, as indicated by their ancient text. However, maybe the Fountainhead Fragrance wasn't originally as hard to gather as it is in the game. We know from the wedding cave, as well as a few item descriptions, that bridal offerings to the palace were considered more common once upon a time, so the Mibu villagers must have been capable of creating the fragrance as well. It's not like just the shelter stone would be enough for an offering anyway, since we know even Tomoe and Takeru can't get back to the Fountainhead Palace without the fragrance. So how were the Okami and the Mibu villagers able to create the fragrance? Let's break it down by ingredient. The first ingredient for the Fountainhead Fragrance is the Lotus of the Palace, which only grows in the Sunken Valley. This one was probably fairly easy to gather, since this may have been before the Guardian Ape started to protect the Lotus. Even if the Guardian Ape was protecting the flower, it's not hard to imagine a group being able to distract the ape while others retrieve the Lotus. The next ingredient would be the aromatic wood of the Everblossom. In the game, Kuro and Sekiro assume this item is impossible to obtain until Sekiro receives it after defeating Ao. However, it's possible that they may have overlooked another Everblossom tree which is perpetually in bloom, even in the gloom of Mibu village. This tree seems to meet the requirements since it is always blooming and the villagers seem to worship it, so perhaps this tree was the source for the wood. The next ingredient would definitely prove a bit more difficult to obtain though, the blood of a Divine Heir. This would actually require both a Divine Heir and a mortal blade. Now we have no idea where either mortal blade was at this time, so the Okami could have found one of them. Given that the Mibu villagers also seem to have access to the fragrance around this time though, I have another theory. My guess is that since the fragrance was needed for the bridal offerings, and since we know that past Divine Heirs have had close ties to the Fountainhead Palace, the Divine Heir must have been in charge of overseeing the bridal offerings. We may even know the name of the Divine Heir at the time the Okami reached the Fountainhead as well, since his Okami guard may still be searching for him in Mibu village. That's right, Lord Sakuza may have been a previous Divine Heir. After all, the only characters in the game referred to as Lord are Ishin, Genichiro, and the Divine Heirs, and we know Orin is an Okami due to her weakness to poison. So it may have been that Orin originally met Lord Sakuza when the Okami were trying to create the Fountainhead Fragrance. I'll talk more about Orin and Sakuza in another video, but this goes to show one of the ways the Okami may have gained access to the blood of a Divine Heir. The final ingredient for the Fountainhead Fragrance is the most crucial though, the Shelter Stone. In fact, I believe the Shelter Stone is one of the main reasons that the Fountainhead even began accepting bridal offerings in the first place. Why would the Shelter Stone be considered such an important item though? After all, it's the only item mentioned specifically in the wedding cave, so why was it such a necessary item? I believe it's because it's the item that the palace nobles needed to transform into the dragon nobles we see in the palace. Remember in the last video how I said some nobles probably didn't transform right away? We know water of the palace was needed for the transformation, but I believe that a shelter stone is also required. The Mibu priest hints at this when we first encounter him. He talks about trying to dissolve something inside of him, and how the water he is drinking is too dilute for it to be effective. However, once he is given the water of the palace, he is able to dissolve what is inside of him, and when we next encounter him, he is transformed. This is because the shelter stone is another item from folklore. It's the Dragon's Pearl. The story of the Dragon's Pearl involves a boy and his mother who discover a magical pink pearl that filled any container to the brim overnight, regardless if the contents were oil, rice, or gold. Naturally, some thieves hear of the pearl, and to keep them from stealing it, the boy swallows it instead. Immediately, the boy becomes incredibly thirsty and drinks the nearby river dry before transforming into a dragon himself. The parallels here are pretty apparent right away. Both the shelter stone and pearl are pink in color. Also, like a pearl, the shelter stone forms inside the body of someone over a long period of time. Finally, after drinking water of the palace, someone who has a shelter stone inside of them transforms into a dragon. This was most likely the main reason for the bridal offerings, as the shelter stones were needed if the nobles wanted to transform into dragons themselves. Regardless though, the Okami were able to gather these items and finish the fragrance. So when they arrived at the Fountainhead, they were probably greeted by a combination of human and dragon nobles. The nobles were probably happy to welcome the Okami as well, since we know from the Yashariku head list that at least one attack had been made on the Fountainhead at some point. So they were probably glad to have guards who were as skilled as the Okami. However, the Okami were not content to remain as guardians of the palace, and before long, they set their sights on Ashina. I have to admit, I'm unsure of the exact reasoning for their attack. Perhaps it was retaliatory from the attack by the Yashariku headless. Perhaps it was on the orders of the nobles. Or perhaps it was their own overzealous desire to protect the divine dragon. Nevertheless, the scroll in Ashina Dojo tells of these ghosts that use the lightning of the Fountainhead gods, and clearly depicts one of the Okami women. The battle did not go well for the Okami though, as we learned from both the scroll and Sabimaru's item description that they developed ways to combat the Okami, redirecting their lightning and taking advantage of their weakness to poison. This failed invasion led to what I believe were two pivotal moments in the Okami's history. The first is that the entrance to the palace and the cave had to be guarded. This task fell to the Okami's priestess, Priestess Yao. Yes, Priestess Yao was most likely an Okami based on a few key details the game provides for us. The first is the general similarity between their laughs as well as their combat styles. The second is that the Okami women in the Fountainhead all wear a certain kind of mask, a no mask. No is a style of musical theater that makes heavy use of masks. The mask the majority of Okami warriors wear most closely resembles what is known as a Yaseona mask, a mask which represented a woman who became a ghost due to extreme grief or jealousy. Priestess Yao also wears a no mask known as a Hanya mask. This mask represents a female demon who is experiencing extreme grief, jealousy, or resentment, making Priestess Yao a demon leading a procession of ghosts. It's true that she doesn't have the immediate weakness to poison that the Okami have, but she may have developed a resistance due to her long period of being infested. After all, the old infested monks in Senpo Temple seem to have become immune to poison with enough time, so the same could be true for her. Speaking of her infestation, this was probably the reason she became the guard to the Fountainhead Palace. She may have been chosen due to her immortality, or she may have decided to become infested so that she could serve as an eternal gatekeeper. I will discuss Yao's infestation more in depth in the next video about the Fountainhead Palace though. Now the second moment that was pivotal for the Okami women was that the women who decided to invade Ashina were unable to return to the Fountainhead. This may be because they were forced to live in exile for failure, however it is much more likely that it's because they were unable to recreate the Fountainhead Fragrance. As a result, these defeated Okami women were forced to flee to the Sunken Valley, where they built the gun fort to defend themselves while they built a stronger arsenal of weaponry and tried to develop a resistance to the poison that caused their downfall. These Okami women also even found a replacement for the divine dragon that they once worshipped in the valley in the form of the white serpents, giant creatures who are also associated with water in Japanese folklore. The Fountainhead itself most likely returned to a state of isolation after this, with access to the Fountainhead being strictly guarded. The Fountainhead was then semi-peaceful for a time, with the Okami learning the ways of the court nobles and the nobles feeding on the vitality of the brides they received. However, this uneasy peace changed once the Okami women began to transform. Now to understand this next part, we need to understand a bit more about how the nobles became the old dragons of the tree. We can assume from the old dragon's human faces and protective behavior towards the divine dragon that the old dragons are probably some of the Fountainhead nobles who transformed first and over time developed into this form. However, the Fountainhead nobles we see in the game look different compared to the old dragons. The Fountainhead nobles have an extra set of arms. It could just be seen as the difference in transformation stages, but there are two facts that suggest otherwise. The first is that the palace nobles drop fat wax and grave wax, items that are basically tumors, suggesting that the palace nobles with forearms are mutated in some way. The second is that the transformed Okami women actually do have a more humanoid appearance. In addition to their similar appearance, we can even see the roots starting to grow on the feet of the Okami women, suggesting they are starting to change into old dragons themselves. With all of this information, we can now piece together the story of the Okami women and the horrific scene we encounter at the top of the palace. When the divine dragon first arrived in the Fountainhead Palace, some nobles formed shelter stones and transformed into a form similar to the Okami women after drinking enough water from the fountainhead. Over enough time, these nobles fully transformed into their highest form as old dragons of the tree. The rest of the nobles must have envied this chance at immortality, but remained human, despite their best attempts. Eventually, though, they discovered that a shelter stone was necessary to transform and began demanding them from Mibu village along with brides. With each new wedding, another noble transformed. However, these nobles who used the shelter stones they acquired from others changed into imperfect four-armed forms. These nobles must have assumed that they would change into old dragons eventually, in spite of how long they had to wait. Around this time, though, the Okami arrive. They are welcome for the protection they offer, and perhaps due to their strong worship of the divine dragon, form shelter stones and change into humanoid dragon forms instead of four-armed ones. Over time, some of these Okami with a stronger connection to the divine dragon begin to change slightly and become more plant-like. This becomes insulting to the original nobility, especially the high-ranking nobles who had been there the longest without changing. Enraged, they turn on their own Okami guards and cannibalize them in an attempt to force their transformation. However, it doesn't work, and instead the high nobility continue to prey on their Okami guards to jealously prevent them from surpassing them. This is the scene we stumble in on at the top of the palace. This is why the Okami bodies in this area have more developed roots on their feet compared to the other Okami, to indicate that they were beginning to transform into old dragons. It's also why the only Okami women past this point all have the less developed roots on their feet, so they weren't considered a threat by the high nobility. It explains the piles of Okami masks in the room as well, to indicate the large number of their victims. Finally, it's also why the nobles in this area are wearing different colored robes to indicate their elevated rank over the other flute nobles who serve them. This is the inevitable fate of the Okami women we see in the Fountainhead. They struggle to find a way to the Fountainhead Palace to serve the divine dragon, where they are instead forced to serve as guards to the nobles before attempting an ultimately failed invasion of Ashina. Defeated, they lose part of their clan and their priestess while the rest of them transform into dragons. But before any of them are able to become one with their beloved divine dragon, they are betrayed and cannibalized by the nobles they had protected for so long. Now obviously this doesn't cover every aspect of the Okami women, and there are a few more videos that I have planned about them, but this is the basic story of the Okami women we see in the Fountainhead Palace, as well as the grisly scene involving the nobles at the top. But not every noble saw the old dragons as the highest form that they could attain. Instead, a very strange group of nobles discovered a path of their own towards immortality. But we will discuss them as well as the strange master they follow next time as we finish our look at the Fountainhead Palace. Until then, everyone.